All right, welcome to technical session number 8, where we will be talking about the all-important central processing unit, which essentially is the brain of our computers. For this particular session, we'll be talking about or be describing some of the various types of processors and articulate how to select processor to match system needs. Hint, hint, see the documentation. We're going to be identifying the CPU as a central processing unit and explain its purpose and the requirements to keep it functioning. Choose an appropriate cooling method, as we do have a few options available to us. Talk about the steps to replacing and installing the processor. Some of these will seem extremely familiar because we've gone over them a few times over the last week. And identify some common pitfalls of the processor and get a set of symptoms and identify some common CPU problems. Throughout this particular technical session, BSMs we want to keep in mind our adaptability, being able to change according to the circumstances and adapt and grow as we need to, maintaining a growth mindset, understanding that we do not know all things, but we are capable of learning just about anything if we're willing to dedicate the time and effort to that course, which is why we're here day in, day out, stressing ourselves out to the limit, shooting for that A+, PC Pro, and Coursera certifications. All right. Some of the types and characteristics of processors. CPU is installed on the motherboard, and it determines in a large part the computing power of the PC you are working on. There are two major processor manufacturers, that's Intel and AMD, although we did say there's a couple others that are rising up. There is what is called ARM architecture, RISC architecture, or ARM CPUs, which we'll get into here a little bit. Apple is using those, and they're smaller processors that produce less heat. They work really wonderfully for mobile devices, so they're becoming some of the more common and popular processors that you're seeing nowadays. They're quickly catching up to the Intel and AMD counterparts, and RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. But again, we will talk about this a little bit more as we go. All right, Intel CPUs. They're sold under various names, Core, Pentium, Celeron brands, what have you. They do have some newer ones. They're extremely low power, portable. Smartphone chips are branded as Atom. And their higher end server ones are called Xeon, I guess it is pronounced. And underneath the laptops, you have the Centrino technology with the interconnect processor chipsets, wireless adapters, and all that stuff kind of built into one unit. And as we stated last week, over time, they're now starting to incorporate the North Bridge and now even the South Bridge into that CPU package as well to increase computing efficiency. So here's some of the evolution of the microprocessors with regards to Intel, working their way up to the 64-bit architecture. I think we're like, up to i9 now, if I remember correctly. I don't know if anybody recognizes what this particular picture is down here. It's like a wire mesh. And on some of the earliest computers, they had these, they're about 6 inches across. And each one of these was kind of like the beginning evolution of computer chips. And each one of these mesh chips that was about 6 inches across represented a single bit. So it was a single switch that was on or off. That's one of the earliest representations of it. So that's this little copper looking picture on the bottom left. All right. Major competitor to Intel is the AMD chips. They tend to be popular in the gaming markets. They tend to be a little bit less expensive than the Intel, and they tend to handle the graphics packages a little bit better. Intel tends to be used more in enterprise situations like companies, businesses, things like that. AMD in the home computers, especially when you start getting into gaming and things like that. They use different sockets than the Intel, so you have to be careful which one you're using with the motherboards that you have. Make sure that they match up. Like we talked about last week, you have the LGA versus PGA. Does anybody remember which is which? Just off the top of your head, who has
land grid array
LGA?
and pin grid array?
Excellent. So who has land grid array?
Intel.
Intel, excellent. Pin grid array is AMD. So even if you don't have the documentation and you look down at the motherboard, you should be able to tell instantly if it is an AMD or Intel motherboard, just based upon knowing that information. So that's before you even get to the documentation and looking at the sockets. Just at looking at the motherboard, you should be able to tell which camp those motherboards fall into. Current AMD families are FX, Phenom, Athlon, Sempron for the desktop. And then they have the Athlon, Turon, V-Series, Phenom, Sempron for laptops. And then we also have the Ryzens that are more popular right now as well. Do you need to know every type of chip and which socket it goes to? No, you do not. However, I would recommend knowing the families of the chips, at least who they go with. So your FX, Phenom, Athlon, Sempron, knowing the families of the chips. Janae, did you have a question?
No, I didn't have a question.
All right. All right, so here's a quick breakdown of the AMD's gaming segments. That would be your Athlon TX, I guess. The X2 would be your higher end consumer, essentially. Like somebody's gonna be doing a lot of work from home, still does a lot of, requires a lot of heavy lifting with the processor, things like that. Then you have your mainstream segment, which is your average consumer. Basic use at home, maybe doing spreadsheets, word processing, a little bit of surfing the web, stuff like that. And then you have the value segment, which is going to be a lower level processor and doesn't have as much computing power, but it is a good starter package for a lower cost. Now, interestingly, having to manufacture all these different types of processors is expensive because you have to set up lines for each one. And I can't remember who mentioned it last week, but they kind of brought up something that actually happened with AMD processors. So AMD was trying to save money at one point, and they figured, you know what? Why don't we just set it up so that we just sell the same processor to everyone? Instead of manufacturing 4 different types of processors at 4 speeds, we'll sell the same processor, but inside that processor, we'll put governors or restrictions on the power that the processor can accomplish. So when they plug it in, it basically says, I'm a value segment, I'm a mainstream segment, I'm a prosumer, and I'm a gamer. So depending on how much they pay. So they figured they would do that. They save money on manufacturing. They don't have to have multiple lines. Consumer will be none the wiser. Unfortunately for them, people figured it out really quickly. And then it just spread across the web. You know, gamers figure, you know, and the hacking community figured it out extremely fast. You just go in, you overclock your CPU to the level of a gaming segment, and all you do is you buy a value segment CPU. Effect of this, they sold very few higher end processors because everybody figured it out pretty early on. All they had to do was overclock their PC. And they learned from this mistake, so they don't do this anymore. Yes, Adriel.
So basically, it's kind of like, imagine somebody is basically like if it's Dragon Ball or something, and they're lying about their power level, essentially. Or
Yes.
they say that they're not what they really are. That's
Correct.
basically what AMD was doing. They were
Yeah.
basically going up to you and saying, hey, this is totally not the same thing that's over here, like your CPU can't handle this. Just
Yeah.
don't even try. Don't think about it.
Exactly. And if you didn't know to go in and just overclock it, then it would have operated as it was like a value segment CPU. But if you knew what you're doing, you get the value segment CPU, and then you overclock it to the gaming level and you're good to go. And that would be operating at normal capacity. That wouldn't even be, stressing it out. That would be still at a normal capacity for the chip.
That's just normal for AMD anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they learned the lesson because they lost a boatload of money on that particular one. So they don't particularly do that anymore, at least not that they've been caught doing. So that was one particular story that came out of there. If you don't know what type of CPU you have, you can go into your system settings and it will tell you under your processor exactly which type of processor you have in there. Is it AMD? Is it Intel? Is it 64, 32-bit architecture? Are you operating off of one of the ARM CPUs? Or what have you? It'll give you the specs for it and let you know what it is. You can look up and see what the capabilities are for that particular one. All right, how does the CPU work? Well, this diagram should be familiar from last week when we were talking about motherboards. So you have your main CPU up here, which is what we're talking about today. And then as we are modernizing a little bit more, the North Bridge has gotten a little bit smaller, is now being incorporated into the CPU. And then now the South Bridge itself is getting even smaller and starting to be incorporated into the CPU, streamlining the communication, making it a lot more efficient. The closer we can get it to the CPU itself or the cores itself, the faster those communications can take place. So overall improving of efficiency. Is anybody here familiar with Moore's Law? Which is every 18 months, technology doubles. This has been going on since the 70s. And right now, like for the last, I'd say about 10 years, we've been technically keeping up with Moore's Law, but not exactly. And how we've been doing that is adding cores to the CPU rather than a single core in each CPU. We've been adding cores to it. So the processor is working more efficiently that way, but the processor itself isn't getting smaller, cheaper, or faster. So that's kind of a way they've been working around Moore's Law, and it's still keeping up with it, but by kind of bending the rules a little bit. Any questions so far on this? Yeah, sometimes it seems like they may be close friends there, Francis. All right. Okay, so let's peel back the cover a little bit on our CPU. So you have the ALU, which is the arithmetic logic unit. This is what's doing a lot of the calculations or whatnot in order to make things happen. Like, so you see pictures and the sounds coming out of your computer. That's where a lot of that actual heavy lifting is doing. You have the control unit, which is essentially guiding information as it is flowing in and out. It's basically saying where it needs to go. And then once it figures out where it needs to go, it sends it to the input output unit if it's going out, and then that directs it to the proper place it needs to go. You have the internal memory cache, which kind of holds on to some stuff while the ALU is working, and like hands the stuff off to the ALU as it needs it in order to perform the calculations it needs. And then you have the registers, which also work as buffers for the system. So this kind of breaks that down a little bit. Input output manages it as it comes in. And who it's supposed to go to, who it's, supposed to, where it's supposed to get directed to. Control unit basically says immediately where things need to go. So it's like a traffic cop for the CPU, essentially. You have the registers, which kind of holds on to stuff. And then you also have the Intel memory cache, which also holds on to it, waiting to be processed by the ALU. And then the buses themselves, all the little lines that connect everything are called the buses. It's basically how the data gets transmitted. So, good screen to take a screenshot of. Has some pretty good definitions for you. All right, any questions where we're at so far? All right, some things to consider when you're upgrading your CPU. So I always say, hint, hint, look at your documentation. Yes, Stacy.
Can you just go back so I can just screenshot that real quick?
Yes, ma'am. Let me know when you're good.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem. All right. So, things to consider: the speed of the processor itself. It's measured in gigahertz, and the clock speeds that the processors are going to support. Does that align with the type of motherboard you're wanting to install that processor in? Motherboard restrictions, CPU the architecture. Is it a 32-bit CPU, or excuse me, a 32-bit motherboard, and you're trying to put a 64-bit CPU on it? It's not going to work. The socket and chipset needs to match up. If you have 10 prongs on the CPU and only 3 on the motherboard, they won't fit and they're going to work together. Memory capability. Can it hold enough RAM to be able to effectively support this CPU? Multi-processing abilities. So if you had a multi-socket motherboard like you would in a server, and you can use 2 to 4 CPUs, we want to make sure that they all match up. They're all operating as need be, and each of those individual sockets are going to have their own memory banks supporting them. Multi-core processing. Interestingly, you can do things called virtualization, where we can run multiple machines virtually off of a single machine. And that ties directly to how many cores we have. And then there's another thing we have that compounds this called multi-threading, where older processors could perform a single instruction at a time. And then, so if you had a 4-core processor, it could perform 4 instructions at one time. With the advent of multi-threading, each core can process 2 instructions at each time, effectively doubling what a normal processor could do. And interestingly, if you had a 4-core processor with multi-threading technology, it actually would look to your system as if you had 8 cores, because each of the 4 cores are able to do 2 sets of instructions at a single time, effectively making it look like it's multiple cores operating, or more cores, double the cores that you actually have. Excuse me. Yes, Stacy, did you still have a question, or are you good?
No, I'm sorry.
No problem. Donald.
Is that the same as hyperthreading?
That absolutely is, but hyperthreading is specific, I believe, to Intel.
Okay.
So one, it's just they copyright the term. So you have one that I think says hyperthreading, one is multi-threading, if I remember correctly. But yes, that is exactly the same thing. Some CPU features the support for virtualization. So if I wanted to rent out some of the computing power of my system, essentially setting up cloud computers. If I had 4 cores with hyperthreading, that would technically be, it would look like 8. So I could actually set up, 7 virtual machines plus my host system for a type 2 hypervisor for virtualization. But if you want to do this, you need to make sure that the CPU supports it. Not all do. And you also want to be sure the motherboard supports it, because not all do. Again, check the documentation. Integrated graphics, most have a basic integrated graphics built in, although it usually is insufficient for many types of gaming and or work, like if you're doing graphics design, animation, 3D design, things like that, engineering. If you're going to be using CAD programs, they're pretty processor heavy. So the integrated graphics would not necessarily be up to par for what you want to use. So you're going to need to add graphics processors on top of that. And then there is some built-in security as well. Yes, Adriel.
When it comes to the integrated graphics, is that something that's becoming more and more prevalent, or it's always there? Because
that's basically what's always been there, because that's what's integrated onto the motherboard and what you normally use when you first turn it on, unless you're adding a graphics card. You're utilizing integrated graphics.
Because that's the thing, I don't think that I have on my particular system integrated graphics.
So you had to have.
I think I had to get a GPU.
Yeah, some of the more modern ones do that, because if you're automatically going to upgrade, there's no sense in them going through the additional cost of adding it.
Go through the lengths of just putting it up. Well, that kind of doesn't make any sense. What if it doesn't work?
Good question. So if your GPU goes bad, everything goes blank.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it makes it really entertaining to troubleshoot.
That's not fair.
Unfortunately, life so rarely is. Yes, Amaya.
Is it related with RAM, the RAM size?
Is what?
Is selecting the CPU is related with RAM?
Well, you would need to know what would be like the minimum capacity for RAM for that CPU to function. So you would need to make sure you had enough RAM to be able to support the CPU you're installing.
Okay.
Or if it's a 32-bit processor, you want to make sure you're not using too much RAM. Because if it's 32-bit, what is our maximum RAM we can use for a 32-bit architecture? Talked about it last week.
4.
4. That's our maximum.
It's
so if I install 30,
it's
all fortunate.
It's unfortunate.
Unfortunate. There you go.
Yeah.
So if I install 32 gigabytes of RAM in a 32-bit architecture, what's going to happen?
It's only going to use 4.
It's only going to recognize 4. So it's just a lot of wasted money. So excellent.
Is it upgradable as a RAM also?
Well, no, 4 is your maximum. You can put as much, if any additional RAM you put above 4, it just doesn't see it for 32-bit. 64-bit, it depends on the operating system you're using, how much RAM it'll recognize. Okay.
Can we upgrade the CPU unit?
Yes, so long as your motherboard supports it.
Okay.
So if your motherboard supports 32 and 64-bit architecture, yes, you could upgrade it to a 64 so long as your motherboard supports that. Yes, Stacy.
So when we say the term integrated graphics, right? I just want to make sure I'm clear. Does it mean it's built in on the CPU? What does integrated means when we use?
Yes, it's built in, correct.
Built in.
Yep. That is exactly what that means. All right. So we talked about this one last week with regards to the motherboard itself, clock speed on the motherboard, which kind of determines the speed at which the CPU and the chipset and the RAM can operate, how fast they can talk. There's that quartz crystal on the motherboard. That's what sets that clock. And the CPU's clock speed is its maximum, not the speed at which it must run. Like my car can, not for real, but my car can go from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, but it doesn't mean I have to do that every time I start my car up, right? It has that capability, not necessarily what I need to do every time. Clock multiplier. So all modern CPUs run at multiples of the system clock speed. We talked about that last week. It's almost like music notes, where the clock speed, you think about it as a whole note. That is just a metronome clicking along. We can work at, ticks top and bottom. So instead of just sending information at the top of each clock speed or each tick of the clock, we now can multiply it. We can click at the top, we can click at the bottom. So now we're sending double the amount of data that we were before by able to breaking down the clock into smaller and smaller sections. So RAM does this, CPUs do this, and it allows us to be a lot faster and more efficient with our data processing. All right. CPU architecture. So we talked a little bit about the 32 bits. They're known as x86 processors. Why? I don't know. I'm guessing it's because of the year that they started using them. I'm guessing. I haven't looked too much into that. I just know 32 bits are known as x86 processors. And 64-bit processors are known as x64 processors. So that's a pretty easy one to remember. So the 32 bits can handle a 32-bit operating system. 64-bit can handle a 64-bit operating system, but can run 32-bit applications by simulating the 32-bit processing. So it's backwards compatible for some applications. And then you have hybrid processors that are x86/64s, which can handle 32-bit or 64-bit operating systems. And AMD is the first one to run that. And then, like we were talking about just a few minutes ago, you have the ARM CPUs. And I'm trying to find that real quick, sorry. Which operates off of the RISC architecture, which is the reduced instruction set computer. These are, again, smaller, more efficient. They produce less heat. So these are becoming extremely popular in the laptop and mobile device markets. And ARM stands for Advanced RISC Machine. So unfortunately, it's an acronym within an acronym. We will see a few of those as we move along. And that's where Apple is kind of diving into the chip market as well, is with these ARM CPUs. All right, multi-processing. So each process, when we're talking about multi-threading, each processor core can process 2 threads or tasks at the same time. We were talking about this a few minutes ago, and it essentially makes one CPU core act like 2. Intel calls it hyper-threading, and then AMD calls it multi-processing and sometimes multi-threading. Yes, Eric.
I did hear before, just add on, that 32-bit processors also have a RAM cap. So I heard they can only have like 8 gigs of RAM max. Any more than that will not. Yeah, 4, sorry. Any more than that, I don't think will register.
Correct.
I think
so. I can put 32 in there, but it's only going to register 4.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another thing that some people might want to look out for.
Yep. And that comes in, especially when we start talking about system requirements for operating systems.
Yeah, exactly.
So when we start talking about that, that's 1102, but I think we will talk about that either this week or next week. We'll start talking about some 1102 stuff. It'll be kind of intermingled in with our 1101.
All right, cool.
All right. So multiple core processing combines multiple CPUs or cores into a single chip. to increase its processing power. We kind of mentioned this before. So you might have that singular housing, which this has the cover off, but you have that singular processor that you put in, and inside you have 4 individual CPUs inside each of the main CPU unit that you're putting into your system. So when they say 4 cores, they're talking about 4 CPUs inside each chip, or quad core. Today, this is extremely common. And it has becoming increasingly more common since around 2014 or so. Now, with this, we need to talk a little bit about cache memory. Inside of the CPU, you have what is effectively 3 different levels of cache memory. So you have L1, L2, and L3 cache inside your CPU. And this is before it reaches out to the cache memory or the RAM on your computer. So it's almost like internal RAM on your CPU. So how it works is you have the L1 caches, which are built onto every single CPU. So each one of your cores has its own L1 cache built directly on top of the processor. This is absolutely the fastest cache possible because it is directly on top of the CPU. And each core has its own. It's also, hands down, the most expensive per megabit or whatever. So there's usually very little of it, but it's extremely fast, and it's the most expensive per unit. Yes, Christian.
So it goes to that before it accesses the RAM?
Yes. So this is like the fastest acting processing. It's literally right there. And then, so that's level 1 or L1 cache. Next, you have the L2 cache, which each processor has its own L2 cache. And it is right next to each of the cores. I believe on the picture, these are your L2 caches. If I'm not mistaken. So it is directly outside the CPU, each core CPU, it's right next to it. It's not quite as fast as the L1, but it has a little bit more storage space, and it's not quite as expensive per unit because it's outside the CPU. It's not directly on top of it. So that's an L2 cache. Next, you would have something that's called an L3, which is your next level up. My horrible drawings. So you would have like an L3 cache that is shared by all of the cores in the CPU. Slowest of the 3, least expensive, has the most storage space. So L1, directly on the processor, fastest, most expensive. L2, each processor has one, and it's right outside each of those chips. Not as expensive as L1, but also not as fast. And then you have the L3, which is shared by all of the cores inside the CPU. Am I making sense with this, or am I not explaining
the
it real
vertical line
clearly?
on the right? On the
Huh?
picture? Is the L3 the vertical lines on the right?
Yeah, this is the L3.
On
I
the
kind of
the chip on
right
the
there.
left. Is it the ones that are like right? Yeah. Is that the L3?
I'm not sure. This may be it here. I'm not sure exactly where they keep the L3. I know this is a heat sink, and I think this is for the general cache for the whole CPU.
Okay. Yeah, it threw me off because you drew a rectangle, so I thought it was actually.
Yeah, I
that.
was just trying to make it easier to kind of visualize it.
Okay, cool.
Wait,
Thank you.
Kelly.
Yo.
Isn't it? We don't really need to know where they are on the CPU because that's not necessarily very important, right?
Well, they may ask, like L3, like they'll say what level of cache memory is shared by all the processors.
Yeah, I remember the access speed as well. It's like there's a certain amount.
Yeah,
of
or which
speed.
is the fastest of
Yeah.
these. So they'll ask you questions about it. So just having a basic understanding of it lets you know. And there are ways you can actually go into your system and look at your three levels of cache for your processor as well. So, but again, we're not meant to be experts on this. This is just kind of basic understanding of the 3 levels of cache memory within your CPU. And here it is broken down a little bit better for you. So thankfully, current CPUs have the integrated memory controller, which kind of works kind of like the traffic cop and is able to manage this flow of information very, very efficiently and effectively, which definitely spikes or it boosts your system performance. Any questions with the L1, L2, L3 cache? Yes, Ian.
I was just gonna ask if you could keep it at this page. I'm like taking notes on it real quick, if that's okay.
We can keep it here for just a second.
Thank you.
Any other questions with regards to this? I think the next slide has a much better visual representation than my absolutely horrendous drawing. But we'll get to that in just a second. Ramon.
Yeah, what is the logical processor? What is that? What would that be?
What the was it the ALU? The algorithmic logic processing unit or whatever?
Yeah, because I'm looking at the task manager and the performance, and it's because as you were going through it, I was just looking at that.
Yeah.
And it says logical processors 4. So what exactly is that?
That would be each of the cores.
Okay.
And that's the algorithmic processing unit, or was it the algorithmic logic unit, excuse me, ALU.
Is the 3 slower because it processes more data?
I would not necessarily. It's also partially due to distance. Because remember, the closer you are to the chip, the faster it can communicate. So this has this, excuse me, the slowest communication because it's further away. The data has to travel a longer distance. But yeah, it could also get to the point where, because all 4 are talking to it at the same time, it slows it down a little bit. But this is very, very small pieces, like small bits of information. Like it'll be like kilobits that it can store. So it's not very big. Anything much beyond that, then it starts kicking out to the RAM to store stuff.
Okay.
Well, that's exactly what I remember. It's like the CPU, like the L1 runs at the CPU speed, and then L2 is half of that, and then L3 is the base speed of the motherboard.
Yeah.
To be clear, so this is for faster communication.
Well, yes. So where they're located is faster communication, but these are all they're supporting the CPU, because remember, you have the CPUs performing
because
thousands of.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So from the book, what I read and what I tried to what I understood, it is a kind of RAM.
Yes.
That how it is a kind of RAM, right?
Yes.
So it's a kind of storage, right?
Yes. It holds information while the CPU is performing the algorithms. So like while it's doing the math, if it's got a little bit too much to handle and it kicks like a couple pieces of information off to the L1 RAM while it's calculating things, and then it needs that information again, it grabs it back, pulls it back, and then if there's a little bit more, like too much for it to handle, it'll kick it off to L2, and then L3, all depending on the size and how quickly they need that information. So you have different sizes and speeds of RAM that the CPU can utilize to perform the calculations as quickly as possible. And this is happening tens of thousands of times per second. All right. Yes, Crystal.
Hello. So when we go to clear out our cache, Kelly,
Mhm.
which one are we clearing out? L1, L2, or L3?
Well, typically when you're clearing cache, you're clearing cache memory for websites. So it's like various websites that you go, like if you go to your bank every day, it's going to have the majority of that information stored in cache memory. So when you go to your bank's website, all it has to do is update a few pieces of information rather than rebuild the whole website. So when you're clearing your cache memory, typically you're clearing out your previous websites that you visited and stuff like that. So that's why websites load a little bit slower after you do the cache, because it's having to build it from scratch, and then it'll save that site to your cache memory. Mm-hmm. Yes, Amaya.
Do we get the same instruction in all L1, L2, L3 or different?
Well, it's going to depend on, again, the size and the speed at which the CPU needs it, which L1, L2, or L3 it's going to use.
So the instructions stored are different in all type.
Pretty much, yes. Yeah.
When the CPU try to find, does it go first in L1 or L3?
Well, L1 is the fastest. It is
Okay.
super fast because it's right on top of the PC, or the CPU. It's integrated. It just doesn't have a whole lot of space. So information that's not very big that it needs immediately, it'll hand it off to that for about, a nanosecond and then ask for the information back. So, it'll use the L1 that way. And then again, as the information becomes larger and larger, they'll use the different other cache memories. And then eventually they'll kick out to the RAM on the motherboard.
It's kind of like you're dividing priority when you're doing a certain task. If you think about it as just the way you're doing something in your regular life, like while you're cooking, you're not necessarily, well, for us right now, we think about what we're going to do when we finish eating, we're going to do the homework, but that's kind of in the back of your mind, that's kind of like the farther it is away from your mind is where you would be storing it. So that would be your RAM, because that's the farthest away. I'm going to do this way after I'm finished with this task. When
So,
you're like your L1 would be, hey, okay, now I'm cutting this up to put in the pot. And after that, I'll wash the dishes and stuff like that.
So if I open multiple windows and also stuffs are in the history, so Kelly, you think those are in L1, L2, or L3?
No, those are typically stored in RAM. Like entire websites are
Can
way
you
too
give us an
big.
example in IT wise, like not kitchen wise, like what could be an L1, L2, L3?
Like L1, L2, L3 may be a couple characters, like, like a part of somebody's name or something like that, just holding on to that information. So if I have, 50 things that need to be processed, but I can only handle 45 at a time, as I get that information, I'm trying to process the 50, I'll hand off the 5 to the L1, and then I'll process the other 45. When I get done with that, I'll pull the L1 back in, those other 5 in, and I'll incorporate that into what I was doing. If I have 50 things to process, the L1 can only hold 5. I need to hand off 15. L1 can't handle it, so I kick it out to L2.
So
And then I process what I need.
So when you use Zoom, do
Uh-huh.
you use L1, L2, L3? Is that
You're
how
using,
it works?
well, you're using L1, L2, L3 all the time.
Okay.
It's always being used. Because as your computer is processing something, it's using those 3 for the bits and pieces of information. And then when that's full, then it's going to start utilizing the RAM. And you're using your RAM all the time too.
All right.
Is that making sense, or am I not explaining it clearly?
For me, hard to understand because I'm
Got
not
it.
getting any particular example.
Okay.
Like in
I'll
a
try
given
one.
situation, I'm not sure if I will figure that out.
Yeah, for the most part, you're never gonna really be worried about the L1, L2, L3. That's kind of taken care of by the CPU.
Yeah.
Right. The CPU does a better job of doing this than we would because we don't move that fast.
Yes.
So it takes care of everything it needs to take care of. You're not really you're not thinking about thinking. That would be like your L1, L2, L3. Your brain is doing certain things that you are not involved in. It just does it. The L1, L2, L3 is for just how the CPU works. It's just splitting
Okay,
it,
now it
it's
makes
stuff like
sense.
that.
Thank you.
And we just need to kind of understand definitionally what they do.
Yeah, like when George said, like active versus passive processing. When it's
There you go.
active, it's kind of like you're on the RAM because that RAM can be like, okay, I'm not doing this right now, so I'm gonna go and do something else, and then it takes out of your memory, and then you go and put something else on it. And your memories would be in your storage, so you can always go back and say like, oh, I fell down the stairs yesterday. Not a true story, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Gotcha. Ian, how are you looking on notes, sir?
I got everything. Thank you.
No worries.
For how
All right.
long does it store the cache?
Do what?
In the cache. For how long
It's usually like a 1,000th of a second. It's literally only there for a brief moment until the CPU needs it again. That's all it
in
is.
all type, okay.
Yeah.
In all L1, L2, L3.
Yes. It's, I mean, you're talking about nanoseconds is how long something, I mean, probably even less than that, how long it's stored in any one of those three cache memories. It's very
It's
fast.
pretty much like at the moment, basically.
Yes. Yes. Like if I ask you to add up 20 numbers and you're able to keep in your mind 15 of them at a time as you're adding them up, then you just use the L1 cache to hold the other 5 until you've added up those 15 numbers, and you say, okay, I'm ready for those other 5. And then you can take them back and then you add them back up, but it's happening 1,000 times a second. All right. Here we go. Here's a quick representation, like visual representation of how the L1, L2, L3 works. To kind of give you an example of that. If you want to take a snapshot of this, also in your system settings under CPU, you can see your L1, L2, L3 caches and how they work, like how much memory you have. You're talking about like L1, 32 kilobytes. That's not a lot of information. L2, 256 kilobytes, so significantly more, but still in the grand scheme of things, not a lot of information. And then L3 gets you up to about 15 megabytes.
So L3 has a better performance than L1 and L2.
L3 has the better,
faster.
no, L3 has the better amount of storage. So it can handle the largest amount, but of the three, it's the slowest.
Okay.
L1, because it is right on top of that processor, is the fastest, but it also has the least amount of information it can hold.
Okay. So L3 just has it just has more storage than the rest of them.
Correct. It's more storage, but slower.
But slow. Okay. Makes sense.
All right.
Is that the norm for the setup? Because why would they build it to have so little storage?
Because you only have so much real estate to work with.
Okay.
I think everybody's getting tripped up, Kelly, because we're talking about storage, even though we're on the CPU. And
Yeah.
because
No.
it's tripped me up before. Is
I
that
get
you're
it. I
not gonna
just
really
wanna know, like,
expect it. Yeah.
why it's so little bit, but as you said, real
It's
estate.
kind of
so
like it's a
it
different
makes
part
sense.
of your brain that you would be
Yeah.
using. You wouldn't be storing anything. You're just trying to process stuff. It's kind of like thinking about your next words when you're speaking.
Yeah, essentially.
So like the L1, L2 would be more of like a quick task, like a one function task, one step, and the L3 would be like multi-task steps.
Yes.
So that's why it's got a higher count. Yeah. Okay.
I
Cool.
mean, you can think of it as like the L1 is like a single task.
Yeah.
L2 is like 2 to 3 tasks. And then like, if you're going to get much bigger than that, you have to go to L3.
Got it. Thank you.
It's kind of like breathing. Your L1 is you always know to breathe, you don't think about it. Your L2 is if you're gonna go in the water, you're gonna hold your nose, and your L3 is like, I don't breathe in water, let me close my mouth too.
Interesting one. I haven't heard that one. But yeah, it seems like it can work. All right.
So Kelly, can I just say something real quick, please?
Yes.
Basically, the L1, L2, and L3, it's all about processing, right? And from what I gather, it has to go, it steps down to L2 and L3, the greater the task is.
Yes.
Okay.
So all the calculations are being done by the core, but the core can't hold all the information. So, but yes, it is all about the processing. All right. All right. So on some of the processors, especially when you're talking about around the Windows 8 and 8.1 area, they needed this, where you have the EDB or execute disable bit, which is some security that is built into the processor, which is referred to as XD in Intel and NX in AMD processors. So when you're talking about Windows 8, 8.1, they require either to have the XD or NX capabilities with regards to, as a prerequisite to being able to install the CPU in and of itself. All right, so this works in conjunction, where to store memory, where to hold it, all that kind of fun stuff. And when it is designated for data, this area is not an execution area. It is strictly for holding on to information. So this prevents what's called a buffer overflow attack. And basically what that is you continually make requests of a system. And as those requests are rolling in, it's taking up more and more of the memory as it's trying to hold on to that information or process that information. You do this enough and it can cause a system to crash. We will talk about this a little bit more when we get to security, but that's basically what's happening. EDB requires a compatible operating system that, like we said, minimum that's going to be Windows 8 and 8.1. You can enable this, that is your lower level of that, using the BIOS or UEFI to enable your EDB settings. So many times it can stop malware from executing within designated memory areas or data storage areas. It cannot remove it. It's still there. It's still a threat, and it can spread and continue to infect your system. So it's not fail-safe. As we say with most security, it operates in layers. I'm not sure if I mentioned this with regards to motherboards, but there actually is a hardware chip that's installed on most motherboards at this point. It's called the TPM. And that is the Trusted Platform Module. And that is essentially like keys to enable encryption. So if you have a hard drive on your computer and you have it encrypted utilizing what's called the TPM, or that little hardware chip that's installed on the motherboard, Trusted Platform Module, if somebody comes in and steals your hard drive and plugs it into another computer, that computer will not be able to decrypt it because it won't have the keys from the trusted platform module of your motherboard. Does that make sense? And that's why Windows 11 is a little scary, because they use the TPM in some really not wonderful ways. But we'll get into that a little bit when we talk more about software. Yes, Crystal. You're muted, so can't hear you.
Thank you. What is an incompatible operating system for EDB?
So that would be like Windows 7, because it wouldn't be able to utilize the EDB systems because it's an older operating system. So it may be able to run the operating system, but it would not be able to utilize the security measures. I think 8 and 8.1 were the first ones that allowed EDB to be enabled. Yes, Nassim.
Yeah, I was ask you about the set of encryption. If the hard disk is encrypted for security reasons, does it slow down the process of reading and writing?
Yes, actually it can. So if something is encrypted, anytime you're going to use that data, you have to decrypt it in order to read it. So that
Right.
takes processing power. So yeah, that can slow things down. So we get into that a little bit, where you have what's called full drive encryption, like something like BitLocker, where you're encrypting the entire drive. And though it's a great security measure, it can slow things down. Or you can use EFS, which is the encryption file system, just to encrypt specific files. So then you would only slow your systems down when you're trying to access those specific files, rather than every time you're trying to access something on the hard drive. So, but it depends on the level of security of what you're dealing with, how sensitive the information is, which of these you would use. Because if you're dealing with research and development for, your company, you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of processing power to make sure all that information is encrypted. So you have to kind of find what works for you. We mentioned it a lot when we talk about security. There's always a balance. It's security versus convenience. The more convenient something is, the less secure it is. And vice versa, the more secure something becomes, the less convenient it is. So you have to find the balance that's right for your company. They call that something like risk appetite, how much risk you're willing to accept in order to grant your employees the convenience needed to achieve the tasks you want them to do. But again, we'll talk about that more in security.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. Virtualization and integrated graphics. Here we go. So, like we talked about just briefly earlier, virtualization essentially is making your computer, or allowing your computer to kind of act like multiple virtual machines. There's like wonderful free programs out there you can get. One of them is called VirtualBox. I believe that's Oracle's. And you can download different versions of software and run that software on your system and get practice with it, or see if your updates are going to affect it. You're essentially operating almost like a sandbox environment. And you can do a lot of neat stuff with it. Like if you want to play around with Kali Linux, VirtualBox was a really good one, although they do now have extensions for Windows where you can install Kali directly on top of Windows, which is a really neat upgrade that they've done recently. So that's virtualization, and you need multiple cores in order to be able to do this, hopefully with that multi-threading enabled. Integrated graphics. So your processor may already have an integrated GPU on it, although it's going to be a lower level than, say, a graphics card if you purchased one. And essentially it is mostly designed to manipulate graphics data in order to give you a better viewing experience, essentially. If you don't have integrated graphics like Adrian was talking about, you would need to purchase something like a graphics card. That would be an external or an additional piece or peripheral that you would install to give you that additional processing power. But at least the vast majority of the time, most CPU packages have integrated graphics built in, at least in a basic sense. Questions with regards to this? All right. CPU sockets. Here's a better picture than what we were looking at last week. You can see all these fun little pins sticking up. This is a PGA or pin grid array, which is an AMD processor, and then the LGA, flat like the land grid array. So that would be your Intel. And this is typically what your sockets will look like. This is that cage we were talking about last week, that little metal box that goes around it. And then you would use this little spring arm to come down and lock it into place so that it can't move. And that is the ZIF, or zero insertion force. And then this little globule of stuff on top of the CPU, that is your thermal paste, which allows for the efficient transfer of heat into whatever cooling method you are currently using. And again, a little bit goes a long way. Because if you use too much of this stuff, it can overflow over the sides and creates a really nasty cleanup. If you don't use enough, you will cook your CPU in very short order. One of the TAs, huh?
Please don't forget that.
Oh, I know. One of the TAs that I started with during the cohort was building his own PC and didn't use any thermal paste. And so quite literally fried the CPU. Expensive lesson, but he has never forgotten it from that day forward. All right. Sockets. As we know, Intel is an LGA. Many of their sockets start with LGA. So it's flat like the land, LGA sockets. Do you need to memorize all of these? No, you do not. I recommend memorizing, not memorizing, but just knowing the naming style they use. AMD makes it a little bit easier. All the chips start with AM. All the sockets start with FM. So it's like AM, FM radio. Just goes together. So AMD usually has FM sockets or AM sockets. Intel, LGAs, and then occasionally they'll use the FCLGA, but usually LGA is in the name. So on the exam, if you get asked about this, you may get one question on it. And basically what I did is they'll give you 2 AMD sockets, 2 Intel sockets, but if you know the naming styles, you can get it down to 50-50, and that gives you a pretty good statistical probability of getting it right. So at least you're eliminating half the field. So just taking a look at how they name their sockets. And just here's some examples of ones. If you look closely, you can see the little pins sticking up from the board. So since the chip you're putting on it is flat, there's actually pins sticking up out of the board, and that's what you will lay the LGA chip on top of. That's what I was saying. When you look at the board, you should be able to tell right off the bat whether it's an Intel or AMD board without even looking at the paperwork. Yes, Nassim.
Sorry.
Sure. Do what?
No, I'm sorry.
No worries. All right, so AMD. Here's what the AMD sockets look like. Bunch of tiny little holes that the pins that stick out from the bottom of the chip for the PGA will stick down into, and then it will lock down from there. Yes, Stephen.
Just like a silly question, but so if you try to put like an LGA inside a socket that has pins, it just wouldn't fit, right? Or would it damage it if you tried to? Or
Well, if you put an LGA in a socket that has pins, that's perfect because that's what you need to do.
I mean,
It's-
sorry, the other way around.
If you put it like, say, if I put an LGA into
Yeah.
an AMD,
right.
nothing would happen because they can't communicate.
Okay.
You have a
Got it.
flat surface laying on top of a flat surface. They're not touching. They won't be able to communicate.
Right.
The other way around, if I put a
Right.
PGA into an Intel board, I've got pins against pins. Best case scenario, best case, I bend a whole bunch of pins.
Okay, got you.
That's the best case. Worst case, I'm gonna be
Right.
snapping pins off and I need a new motherboard and a new chip.
Got you. All right, cool.
All right. So CPUs, they do a lot of work. Because they do a lot of work, they produce a lot of heat. So we have to have a way to effectively manage that heat that is coming off of it. A CPU can go from room temperature to about 400 to 500 degrees in about 2 to 3 seconds. It's really fast how quickly they heat up. So the standard way you would do this on a typical machine that you would use in an enterprise setting, like somebody who's just doing basic operating, data entry or something like that, or your average home consumer, they're typically going to use a setup that looks something like this, where you have the heat sink on top of it and then a cooling fan forcing the air down through the heat sink to aid in the cooling. And how that works, it's kind of like a sandwich. You got your CPU. On top of that, you put your thermal paste. On top of that, you put your heat sink. And then on top of that, you clip in your fan. So CPU, thermal paste, heat sink, fan. And that will work for most setups. TPM is Trusted Platform Module. That is essentially what would hold the keys if you wish to encrypt your hard drives.
Kelly, I have a question. Is there anything that you can do to prevent your CPU from overheating?
Yes, effective cooling management. If you mean ever, I don't know if there is a tried and true that will make it so that it will never, ever, no matter what, overheat. But they have a few creative methods that they do use. So this is your most basic one right here. Like we said, CPU, thermal paste, heat sink, fan. Other than that, there's a few other ones. So here's same slide we saw last week. You have your heat sinks, which have these little metal blades that stick up. And that helps transfer the heat from the flat surface that's connected to the chip, draws it away. And then the fan sits on top of that, forcing air through those blades, causing it to cool down. Now, other methods you can use, they have submerged computers, where essentially you put a computer inside a liquid. The whole computer in there, no heat sink needs to go on top of the CPU. This is typically mineral oil. This is hands down, no question, most effective way of distributing the heat. It's also the most expensive, and it's a little high maintenance because you do have to change that mineral oil on a pretty regular basis. Because dust and debris can get in there. The more dust and debris, the less effective it can be at channeling that heat away. And then what is more common, less common than the standard with the heatsink and fan, but the next level up is liquid cooling for your CPU, which is not the same as a submersible. This works almost like a radiator on a car. You have a metal plate that is stuck to the CPU. You get the CPU thermal paste, metal plate. In that metal plate, there will be liquid that is essentially being pumped through it. That liquid gets pumped into what essentially is like the radiator on your car. It cycles it through a bunch of little fan blades that can cool it down. It's very effective at drawing that heat away. And for higher cooling needs, like more than just a standard computer, like if you're gonna be gaming or something like that, where you're gonna be using up a lot of CPU power, producing a lot of heat, this is a really effective way to do this. And they have a lot of fun options with this, because you'll see gamers, like a lot of gaming rigs are essentially also like art pieces as well, which is why they tend to have the clear sides, because if you have a really cool gaming rig, you want to show it off, right? So if you go online and you look, there's a lot of really neat stuff that people have done. Some of them are even mounted on the wall, like actual tried and true art pieces. So the whole system is completely like broken down, mounted on different, art pieces essentially on the wall, liquid cooling running through it. Very, very cool stuff, open air computers. But more commonly, you'll see them in a single tower like this. But again, they'll have those clear sides so that you can see like the LED lighting, the kind of GPUs they're running. They'll be a lot more aesthetic, like instead of having all the multicolored wires, like all the wires will have some sort of color scheme, like they'll be all like purple, or they'll be all like black or red, whatever look you're going for. And they're more display pieces now on top of really powerful computers. Questions so far? All right, removing and installing a CPU. We go through this one pretty quick because the steps have not changed. Pretty similar to what we were talking about with the motherboard. Any new piece of equipment you have, you leave it in its protective bag until the moment you are ready to install it. I know it's pretty, it's awesome. You want to take it out, look at it, and just, bask in its awesomeness now that you've purchased this really new and, powerful processor. But you gotta restrain yourself, keep it in the bag until it's ready to go. Power down the system, press the button for 3 to 5 seconds. Why do we do this, Brianna?
Any access charge that might still be in the system.
Excellent. We want to remove any residual charge. Beautiful. Thank you. So we want to make sure we just power it down, unplug it, hold that down for 3 to 5 seconds, disperse the charge. After that, we remove the door, access the PC, and use our ESD safety precautions. What are some possibilities we can use for this? Ninjin, what's one possible ESD protection measure we can use?
Glove.
A glove, ESD gloves, excellent. Madison, what is another ESD precaution we can use? He said gloves.
We can use the bracelet.
Bracelet, excellent. So that's 2. Hien, can you tell us the third?
Me?
Yes.
Mats.
Mat, ESD mats, perfect. So that's the 3 different ESD measures we can use. Excellent. So once we have that set up, we have access to the system. The heatsink should be readily available. It can either be removed by screws or it has clips that can be removed. And we make sure we use that X method that we've talked about multiple times in the removal of that. And then we remove, once the heat sink's done, we can set the heat sink off to the side, or the fan, then the heat sink. Then we can remove the old processor and put its own protective bag so that it can be safe. And then after that, you look and see the condition of the thermal paste, which if we're replacing the CPU, likely we're going to have to reapply at that point. So once we have the CPU exposed, we can open it up. You can see the open cage on our ZIF right here. So it's opened up, and then you see that little arm right here. Once that's opened up, we can remove our chip. Then we set the new one back in, gently close the ZIF, and then lock the arm back down. And then we essentially back out. Again, this should not be how you're handling your CPU. I really hope you're using that little chip installer, just because, the cautionary tale I mentioned to you guys last week. Yes, Babakar.
Okay, and also when you installing the CPU, I think there's an
Mhm.
arrow on the corner that
Yep, it's
guides
right
you
here. It's
as to
pointing
where
to
you
it
to
right
put
here.
it.
It's a little yellow arrow.
Exactly.
And then
So
there's a
if
little
you,
yellow arrow on the board. Who remembers what that little yellow arrow represents?
The orientation in which you install the CPU.
Yes, but that little yellow arrow shows up in multiple places. It shows up in other areas. So there's a very specific meaning to that yellow
Was it
arrow.
the top? It's about like the direction up.
It helps with orientation, but it specifically is indicating something.
Is it for the bus? Like where?
Is
Not
it
for the
a
bus.
roadmap?
Yeah, it is kind of a roadmap, but it's indicating something very specific. So that triangle represents something.
The way you should hold it.
Not the way you should hold it, but it does help you with orientation, putting it in. It's letting you know the position of something.
Is it the backside of the CPU?
It's not the back.
What
Well,
about-
remember that yellow arrow shows up in multiple places, not just on the CPU.
Kelly, is it the orientation of
Where the
I forgot how to
the
line it
zip?
up.
because it's part of the motherboard too. I just forgot.
Yeah, that it shows up in multiple cases. What were you
the
saying,
motherboard.
Adriel?
Is it just the orientation of the ZIF?
Well, I mean, again, that triangle shows up in multiple places, not just on the CPU section of the motherboard. It
Does it
shows
point
up
to the
in
North
several
Bridge?
locations. Doesn't point to the North Bridge.
Is it
guessing.
is it
I
showing where
forgot.
the screws go?
Not where the screws go, because there's only one triangle on the processor and one on the motherboard for the CPU. But there's other places where it shows up, and it does have to do with orientation, like how it goes in. But that yellow triangle specifically is telling you the location of pin 1.
Wow.
So if you have 20 pins,
Aha.
the yellow triangle tells you where pin 1 is.
I guess it's nice, but it seems a little excessive.
So,
So you're supposed to inlay it by that first,
correct.
right?
So
Okay.
the yellow triangle on the chip tells you where pin 1 is located on the chip. The yellow triangle on the motherboard tells you where pin 1 is on the motherboard, so you can orient and plug it in the correct way.
Oh, okay. That's nice.
There's a few other connectors where the same thing comes up. And you may only have the triangle on the board and not on the connector. Or you may have it on the connector and not on the board. But the indicator of that triangle means pin 1.
Where else does it show up? Because I forgot.
I believe the P1 connector, it shows up. I think possibly on RAM. It won't be on the RAM module, but it'll be on the board itself. So there's a few places it may show up. There might be a couple power connectors that shows up on as well. So, but in almost any electronics nomenclature, yellow triangle, pin 1. Doesn't mean caution. I guarantee you they're going to throw that one in there. Does that mean caution? No, it's pin 1. All right. So once we got the CPU installed, we gently close that cage down, lock the arm down in there so that CPU is nice and secure. Then we will put our thermal paste on there if the heat sink that we're putting on does not already have it applied. Most new heat sinks already have it pre-applied on the heat sink, so please make sure before you do that so you don't use too much. No, Amanda, that is not where it is used for the password reset. That is mostly just so you can line up orientation for power and processing. So you want to make sure pin 1 goes into slot 1. All right. Yes, Casey.
So on Coursera, the second week, I believe, they showed the person showed how to apply it.
Mhm.
And he just used like a regular flat piece of card to like
Mhm.
spread it out.
Yeah.
Is it possible just to put it in the middle and like, I don't know, like, is that
You
the
could.
only way to do it that way, or
No,
is
it's
there
not the only way. And some people just do it that way. They just put a little bit in the center and they go ahead and put it on there. The reason why they was spreading it out is it ensures even distribution. When you have it as like a little like blob in the middle, when you press it down, it's not necessarily going to always be evenly distributed. So, but good question. Just so long as it's always there. All right, once that's done, you put the heat sink back on top. Then you put your cooling fan on top of that, lock it down, either with screws or with clips. Again, using the X pattern and securing it down. Make sure at this point to please plug in your fan so that it will work. And it should be clearly marked on your motherboard where the CPU fan needs to be plugged in. Typically a 4-pin connector, but if it only has 3 pins, what do we do and why?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Not
please?
Adriel. No.
Got me.
Can you repeat that?
So the typical CPU fan has 4-pin connector. I go to plug it in on my motherboard and there's only 3 pins. What do I do and why? Galen.
You can still plug it in because I believe that the 4th pin is for the power, like the speed of the fan.
Absolutely correct. So 3 pins sticking up from the board. I have a 4-pin connector. I go ahead and plug it in because that 4th pin is just for speed. I can still get cooling. It's just going to be all the way on or all the way off. Excellent. All right. Stop here for about 2 seconds. I got to reshare. There was a video.
Hi there, this is Ranjit from tech2bas.com, and in this video we're going to install Intel processor on this motherboard. And the motherboard that you're seeing is an OSIS motherboard based on the Intel Z77 chipset. And this supports both the Sandy Bridge and the Ivy Bridge chips based on the LGA socket 1155. And I'm going to use a LGA 1155 chip on the same. And the general thing before attempting to do something like this is that you notice this is the motherboard, and the thing that you have to keep in mind is any static electricity that you might have built up should be dissipated before even you touch the motherboard, because it can damage the motherboard. So I suggest wearing a anti-static wristband or grounding yourself before attempting to do the same. And for this test, let me move the motherboard. I'm using a stock Intel kit in which we get this CPU cooler and the chip itself. And if you take out the CPU cooler, as you see, the thermal paste is already pre-applied. So I'm not going to apply the thermal paste here, but if you're using an aftermarket air cooler or something like that, you might need to apply the thermal paste on the chip. And this is the actual motherboard. Let me just zoom in a little bit, because this is the area where we're going to work. And the first thing you do is gently press this and move this and open this latch, and this latch will open this way. And now you need to open the processor that you have. Do notice that this is the processor and you should not touch this area. Gently lift it, and let me just move the motherboard, and let me show you one more thing that is a little bit important. Let me see. Yeah, if you notice here, you can see these 2 notches, and on the socket of the motherboard also you'll have similar 2 notches. Let me bring the motherboard now, and as you can see, here are the 2 notches. So, and we also have an arrow over here, and we have an arrow on this. So you just gently place the chip and it should sit down. And now what you have to do is bring back this plate like this and depress the lever. Do note that you might have to apply a little bit of pressure. That is okay. Now you have installed the chip. Now what you have to do is, now we are going to install this fan on the same, and to do that it's also pretty easy. Let me show you the motherboard actually. Let me just zoom out a little bit. And if you notice, we have these 4 holes over here, and our stock Intel cooler will mount there. And let me just zoom in a bit so you get a better view. And what we do is we gently place this over here, over the 4 holes approximately, and those 4 pins should just go down gently. And now what we do is hold on to the processor like this and just depress, and you'll get a clicking sound. And do the same for the next one and proceed with the others. You should get this clicking sound that you have heard. That means we have fixed the CPU cooler. And now the last thing that we need to do is, let me show you the same. Your motherboard should have a header like this known as the CPU fan, and you now just need to attach the CPU fan and that's it. And that's how you have installed your CPU on your motherboard. And let me just turn the motherboard 1 second. And if you look at the back, I want to show these tiny pins. They should come out. That means you have successfully properly installed the stock Intel CPU cooler. So that's how you actually install Intel CPU on a motherboard. And in my next video, I'll be installing the other components like RAM, connecting the actual SMPS to this motherboard, and we're going to power it on. So stay tuned to my YouTube channel for that. If you aren't subscribed, hit the subscribe button. If you found this video helpful, I'll appreciate if you click on the like button again below. That's it for now. This is Ranjit from tech2buzz.com, and I hope to see you in my next video.
All right, so that's a pretty straightforward demonstration of installing it. I wish I could say that all the motherboards and stuff you'll be handling and dealing with are going to be as clean and easily manageable as that one. But I would be really, in effect, lying to you, especially in an enterprise situation where a lot of times you open them up, there's going to be a lot of dust, stuff like that in the systems. They can be, you know, a lot dirtier than you would think. But that is very quick, concise, and very easy video to go through. So, all right.
One more thing, Kelly.
Yes.
Just because he's touching it all over the place doesn't make it okay.
Yes. Absolutely
Kelly,
correct.
Did he even use paste? I didn't even see that.
It was
already pre-applied to
okay.
the fan. He specifically pointed that out. He said, if it's an aftermarket, you would need to install it, but this one, it's already pre-applied to the heatsink, so we're okay. The X diagram, Christine, yes, because what happens is if you push down one side and then the other, it could bend and then actually could end up damaging or breaking it because you'll be forcing the clip down. If you put it down in an X pattern, it's more evenly distributed and you have less likelihood of actually damaging the board or the processor. All right. Questions, comments so far? Did we learn more about processors today than we wanted to?
Well, we learned what he did wrong.
Yes, he picked it up with his fingers.
Yeah.
Uh,
All right. Some installation pitfalls. If you're using an older motherboard and you're trying to remove an older chip and put a new one in, too much force, if it's kind of stuck in there, may actually cause some of these pins to break off inside the socket. This is zero fun. But you may be able to salvage this with tweezers to be able to get those pins to come out. If you can't, unfortunately, the motherboard would need to be replaced at that point if you cannot get the pins out of the older sockets. Thermal paste has fused the CPU to the heatsink. This does happen. Don't grab and twist to try to pull it off. Don't try to yank it off. An easy thing you can do, it says carefully twist. I would say there's a much easier way to do it. Keep unwaxed dental floss in your tool bag. It's very cheap. Keep it in your tool bag. If it's stuck and not coming off easy, you literally just put the floss on one side and you slowly just work the dental floss through it. It cuts that suction and allows it to come right off pretty easily. You don't damage the processor or the heatsink in the process.
yes, unflavored too. Plain.
Yeah, no flavor, no wax. Thank you for that. I didn't even think of that. So, all right. So the arm holding the LGA array CPU socket won't latch. Open it back up. Make sure that it's seated properly. So open it all the way back up. Don't force it. Just make sure it is sitting in there. Like if there's little plastic notches, make sure it's sitting in those notches correctly. And the ZIF should be able to close correctly after that. If it doesn't, at that point, take it out, look, make sure you don't have bent pins, things like that, because it shouldn't require a lot of force. Make sure there's no pins stuck inside the holes inside the board, things like that. You shouldn't have to force it. So once it's, once you've verified all that stuff, you should be able to put it in and latch it down. If it still won't, verify the socket and the chip are compatible. Questions so far on this? The main issue you'll see with CPUs tends to go with overheating, and that's usually a thermal paste issue or insufficient cooling. All right. You're saying mostly CPUs tend not to have any kind of mechanical problems. Usually if you start seeing intermittent issues, it's other hardware issues causing the problem. Heat sinks not operating properly, or the thermal paste wasn't applied properly, so you're starting to overheat on a regular basis. Motherboard is not getting a constant flow of power, so if you have a failing power supply, or if the motherboard is starting to fail and it's not getting sufficient power to the CPU, that will cause crashing to happen. And then you also might have intermittent problems with communication, also due to a failing motherboard. Catastrophic issues will cause you to get a post error. And then, checking that post error will ask you to check the CPU and see if it is a CPU issue. That would be the first step in diagnosing. You get that post error, look it up, and if it says CPU issue, then you would start working from that perspective. But we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. Questions, comments, complaints, revelations? All right. Now we should be able to describe various types of processors and how to articulate how to select a particular processor for our system that we currently have, identify the CPU as the central processing unit and explain its purpose and the requirements of keeping it functioning. We should be able to choose an appropriate cooling method, like the submerged computer, although it may look cool, may not necessarily be practical for your needs. Name the steps to replacing and installing a processor, identify common pitfalls, and symptoms to that as well. Any questions with regards to CPUs? Yes, Babukar.
Do you have any techniques as to how to unbend bent CPUs like the pins?
The way we did it when we bent the ones we had was quite literally a magnifying glass. Like I have like little one that goes on my head that magnifies pretty good. I was using that and then a precision pliers and gently just bending them back into place, being very, very cautious. And you got about a 50-50 shot. If you overbend it, you'll just break them. So you got to gently kind of coax them back into place. It is doable as long as there wasn't too much damage to the pins when they were bent initially. But just remember, most of them are, the pins nowadays are smaller than the diameter of a human hair. So they're very, very fragile. But yeah, magnifying glass and then some kind of like probe or pliers to kind of push them back into place.
Okay, it's a similar method that we used to like the magnifying glass, and you can use a pencil just to gently move it around. I thought there was another way.
Although nowadays I would say the pencil lead is probably a little too thick and blunt. So like a probe, like I have like dozens of these around the house that I keep, and it has become like my universal multi-tool with working on electronics, because it can be used as a pry bar or probe. It's good at, you know, coaxing things in a position with regards to like pins and stuff like that, and they're pretty inexpensive to get. So
cool, thank you.
All right.